Glad y'all are here. Hey, we're live at Rosenthal. We'll start in just a couple of minutes.
Gentlemen, y'all gonna have to talk up a lot or get microphones on.
Into the meeting.
Okay.
I hear Davey a little better than Dan, but he was closer to the computer.
There's Jody. Jason Bagley, are you in here?
I am.
Oh, did he?
Give it about 1 more minute and then we'll start.
Okay. Come by and see me when you get off though.
Oh, I got it.
Hey, Captain, my picture doesn't show up on it because it's not on.
All right, Dr. Griffin, let's go ahead and get started. Howdy. That's what we say here at Texas A&M. We start a class and we're in the classroom, lecture room at Rosenthal Meat Science and Technology Center. This is where our meats laboratory is at Texas A&M University. And Dr. Griffin and I, as part of the mission of this particular building, is extension program. We're really happy to have you with us tonight. And I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of fun. This is probably the most fun part of Beef 706. And I wish you were here because, Dr. Griffin, what would happen if they were here right about now?
Well, right now, or about now, they would have made those estimates. We would let them look at these carcasses for a few minutes and try to see how well or maybe how well they didn't do. I don't know, you know, Gordon.
Right.
We always say that when you're looking at a whole pen of them, it's easy to do. But when you're looking at one individual, who knows? You know, and so we'll look at those, go through that. Then we talk about anatomy. We talk about all the different parts of these, which we're going to do tonight a little bit. And then we would actually show them all the equipment, suit them all up in all of that gear, hand them a knife, and say, y'all get after it.
Yep, and who knows what was going to turn out after that.
Well, we know at least we'll have ground beef. We don't know what else, but
tonight, everybody here might be ready to go out, at least eat the steak.
There you
I've
go.
got a beef. Everybody eat steak tonight.
Dr. Hale, it's Ron Gill again.
5 carcasses from those animals we showed
We
you.
can't hear Dr. Hale.
We'll talk about how the carcass data actually did. And so as you look at the carcass data, we'll talk about yield grade and quality grade and kind of how they fit in the grid. We'll give you that data here in a minute, but we just want to stand back and kind of look at the carcasses first. So what you have here is actually, this is animal number 3. This is 4 and 5. 1 and 2, which we're not going to go too much in depth tonight when we talk about fabrication. Those are the 2 Angus cattle. But we will talk about the grade data, but actually we're going to zero in on fabrication on these 3 animals because they are significantly different. When you look at cutout box beef value. And so we have the red calf down here, right? And this has been the Holstein, and this is the beef on dairy cross. And the first thing you ought to probably notice is just kind of looking at them.
okay.
All right. Yep. And so we take a look at these animals. Dr. Griffin, why don't you go ahead and kind of visit about what's different about this one versus those 2 on the end?
Well, you know, one of the things as we talked about, and I know Dr. Hale talked about last night as we were doing this, those have some different carcass characteristics. And, you know, most of the cattle, once we get the hide off, we get them all hanging up like this, they're just beef carcasses. We can tell heifers from steers and those kind of things, but there are a few that we can readily discern actual structural differences in when we look at them for the most part. And so if we think about it, you know, Bos Indicus cattle are going to have a lot of times a hump, at least some. You know, if it's a 3/8 or an 1/8 or whatever, It may not have a real discernible one, but if it's a full blood or half blood, a lot of times they're going to be able to walk down the rail and see those humps sticking out there to discern those carcasses from others. And so you can see on this carcass a little bit of a hump. We said yesterday that he was Red Angus, but he was also Beefmaster, right? We thought. And so he does have some Bos Indicus in him. There's a little bit of a hump here. The animal next to him has a little bit of that also, but it's more of what we call a crest. And actually, if you look at it, it's a little lower down. It's more on the neck. And we said last night that Holstein still had one testicle, still had some of those male characteristics going on. And so he actually does have a little bit of a crest down here on the neck of that animal versus the steer here that was the beef on dairy that doesn't have very much at all. So there's a difference there. There's also a difference in shape of muscle in some of these. And so even though we would be able to tell this had some Bos Indicus influence, it has a really plump round, really thick, wide, plump round versus our Holstein, even though this Holstein was a pretty good Holstein in terms of muscling, he still has a very angular round, and he's going to have a really big forequarter here. This barrel area here on this carcass is much larger than it is on any of the rest of them. The beef on dairy is kind of in between. It still has a little bit of slope to the round. I should have said too, a lot of times on the Holsteins, we'll see them have a really irregularly shaped ribeye, maybe triangular shape as we look at that. And this one does have a triangular shaped ribeye, but it is a pretty good size one for what we would have expected it to have. The beef on dairy is more round or symmetrical in shape, has a little bit of a slope to the round. It's kind of in between those two, I think, Dr. Hale, as we look at them. The other two beef are pretty close to our first one down here.
All right, so let's visit a little bit about what I talked about last night. And then, Dr. Griffin, I'm going to ask you to just kind of talk about these two animals. They're only 30 pounds different. And then as you're doing that, I'll get the slides up. But if we take a look at it, remember, this is one side of beef. There's another side of beef that's in the cooler still. Actually, we cut up in the box beef, I should say. And this is one other side. So we've actually split that animal right down the middle of the backbone. Half of the backbone is over here and half is on the other side. And so this is one side, one half of beef. And then we ribbed it between the 12th rib and the 13th rib. And it exposed the 12th rib cross section. And from this, we're going to look at marbling. So for quality grade, we look at these chine buttons down the back. This is a young animal. Then we look at the marbling in the muscle, and then we come up with a quality grade, if you remember from last night. The next thing we'll do is now come up with a yield grade. And to do that, we measure the fat opposite the eye first, measure the ribeye size, the ribeye of this one big muscle. And then we look at the weight, and then we look at kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. So the kidney actually has been removed out of this one right in here. That's where the kidney fat, where my fist is. That's pelvic fat would have been up there. You can see a little bit there. And then there's some heart fat down here. And so that's kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. And it's about, if it was there, it'd be somewhere close to 2.5% of the weight of the animal. All of that goes into that yield grade 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Remember, 1's the best, 5's the worst. So Dr. Griffin, just kind of talk about the differences in, as you're going to get ready to talk about cutout, just here's two animals that are only 30 pounds different, how different they look like when you look at carcasses.
Well, it's kind of interesting because they are different in shape. That muscle's different in shape. But if we think about these, this carcass, number 3, you can see is substantially fatter, and that's pretty typical of anything that's going to be a beef type animal. We said last night, on that graph that we were trying to shoot for about 5/10 of an inch of fat, because if they had 5/10 of an inch of fat on the outside, then chances are they've been able to put marbling on the inside. And that's really the way cattle deposit fat. They'll put it on the inside, that kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, other fat around the mesenteric area, all around the internal organs, those kind of things to protect those. They'll put it on the outside. Next is subcutaneous fat. The third place they're going to put fat in is between the muscles. A lot of times we'll refer to that as seam fat or intermuscular fat, which is like interstate highways. They go between states. Intermuscular fat in between muscles. And then finally, if they have the right plan of nutrition, they're going to put marbling on the inside of this muscle. And again, as we grade these, the only place we're going to really look to grade them is right here at this 12th, 13th rib interface. And whatever we grade this carcass here applies to the whole carcass, not just a part of it, but for the whole carcass. So that's what we do on the whole animal. We don't just grade pieces or parts. Also, Dr. Hale said that other side was here as well. If we were going to do this, we would look at both sides. And if one side has more marbling or has a larger ribeye or whatever, we're going to use the best side. So even though today you're just seeing one side, we actually saw both sides when we looked at these and determined a grade as best as we can determine a grade. Now, we're not official USDA graders, but we've been trained to do that. But officially, I can't grade this carcass. I can just tell you what I think it is, but we could not sell that and put it into commerce as choice or select or prime or something like that. The dairy steers, I'm looking at it. Now, this one has enough fat on it. We're going to be able to, if we were putting these in a small locker plant where we might age these for a while hanging. This one certainly has enough finish on it that we could let him age for a while. And we talk about aging, taking about 10 to 14 days to kind of get the maximum amount of the big curve of aging to let it do its thing. Now, will they continue to age if we hang them longer? Yes, but it's kind of a diminishing effect at that point in time. We start losing more and more in terms of moisture, in terms of having to trim more off of them than it's worth. Now, at the same time, we get on some of these that don't have any outside fat. 2 weeks is a long time in the cooler. And so what really happens in most plants is those carcasses are actually cut in about 48 hours, 48 to 72 probably at the most. And so as they go in and they're cut, we vacuum package those cuts. Aging continues to happen at the same rate in a vacuum bag as it does hanging on the rail. The only difference is if we leave it hanging or if we've got cuts that we're aging as dry aging, as you'd call it, then that's going to actually change the flavor profile a little bit because we're allowing some of that moisture to leave, so we're concentrating those flavors. We're also maybe getting a little rancidity from the fat and those kind of things as part of that as well. So we're going to get a little of those things, but aging is kind of the same as we look at that. We look at this animal, there's some things that we're going to be a little different, looking at a little differently. A lot of times with these Holsteins, they're not going to have quite as big a ribeye, and it may not really fit in the box with this really pretty one here beside it. You may be able to see up there that there's a little bit of discoloration in this, and don't worry about that tonight. These were ribbed 4 or 5 days ago for another program, and so it's just started to discolor here on the surface. But some of my concerns is that I'm going to have less muscle here and probably have to, and it's going to be in a trade-off to bone. And so we, could have a higher % bone there. Okay. This is not Aggie math. We do have a reason for having these out of the order of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? Because we're going to leave some out here while we put some others back in the cooler so that we don't leave them out here because we're not in a cold room right now. So number 3 is the big red calf that was Bos Indicus, had some Bos Indicus base on him and some red Angus. So we knew him. He was number 3. This is number 4, and this was the large Holstein calf. And we said still had one testicle, so he had some masculine and characteristics, and also he was a little aggressive out there in the pen, wasn't he, Dr. Hale? He was a little bit high-headed and kind of moved around a lot. So that was the Holstein. This was a black calf that was number 5 in the list. He was the one that was a little lighter boned, a little lighter weight. He was a lightweight to start with compared to the rest of these, but he is Angus by Holstein. Okay. The next one here is number 1, and this was the big black calf, really muscular. It was a lot of Angus in him. We don't know whether they were full-blood Angus or not, but he was a black calf that had a lot of Angus characteristics about him. And then number 2 was the taller, bigger black calf, a little heavier weight, that was also black, had a lot of Angus traits about him. Okay.
All right, so what we want to do now is we're going to go through and talk about some of the data and actually show you a close-up of each of the pictures of the cattle. So again, you saw the cattle live on Ranch TV. If you want, hopefully you can go to that channel. There's other videos that you can take a look at as well. And again, thank you to the Texas Beef Council for their support of this program. And this is brought to you through Texas AgriLife Extension. So we talked about the grid. We're going to talk about how we sold these cattle on the grid. Remember, dressing percent's important. They are different in dressing percent as we go through there. We're going to show you their quality grades here in a minute. We're going to show you their yield grades as well. Remember, 1's the lowest, the best, and 5's the fattest. And then, then we have some other issues, and we take a look, hopefully get to the data. So let me just end the slideshow and see if my pictures will show up. Well, they're not, but we'll get to the next one. All right, so here's the data on number 1. So this is the number 1. This is the black calf. And as you look at the black calf, this animal weighed 857 pounds and had a 66% dress. The actual fat over the ribeye was 8,500, so it's pretty fat, but it had a large ribeye. And this carcass, for an average carcass of this weight, the USDA has a little schedule, and the average carcass of this weight should have about a 14 square inch ribeye, and this one has a 15.3. And so with that, you can see that it has a 3.4 yield grade. So instead of a yield grade 4, it would have started out in the yield grade 4 with a preliminary yield grade, if you remember that from last night. But because of the ribeye size, it got brought back into a yield grade 3. And it was a maturity, low choice. And if you look at the live value is $1,238. Remember, that was $96 times the live weight. Because this carcass is choice, it's a yield grade 3, and it weighs between 600 and 1,000 pounds, it gets the par average grid price. Right now, the par kind of general price for a carcass that is a choice yield grade 3 that weighs between 600 and 1,000 is $157 per 100 pounds. And so it gives you a carcass a carcass price of $1,346, because you take the 157 times 8.57, and that's where you get the 1,346. And so this carcass made money compared to live. It was worth more on the carcass grid than it was if you had sold it on a live basis. Now, how does a feed yard operator know what to do with that? How do they know how to sell that? Well, they sell a lot of cattle. They see the cattle. Some, they have some maybe prior history of how those cattle fed in the feed yard, and so that gives them kind of a leg up. But they're kind of looking at cattle and saying, well, of this pen, what percent of this pen right now would be choice? What percent would be prime, maybe CAB? What percent would be select, or even what we might call no rolls? Out of that pen, they would kind of make those estimates. And then they also would look at the same time as kind of guess the dressing percent, and then also look at yield grades as well. So they kind of look at those combinations, and they have probably maybe 8 different ways that they can sell those cattle, particularly up in the panhandle of Texas. You could sell to the different packers that are up there, the different companies that are up there. You could also, within those companies, sell maybe on a formula and a negotiated grid versus live. So there may be many ways that that feed yard could look at that pen and say, okay, I think this is the best place to send that pen. So make sure you talk about to your feed yard operator and manager just to kind of get an idea how they market their cattle and what kind of options they have. Because certain cattle they know will fit better at certain plants. Some plants, maybe because of their box beef orders, maybe they put more value on yield, the yield of red meat. And maybe some, because of their box beef orders, they need more choice or prime. And so they'll kind of value cattle based off of that kind of information. So that was number one. Number one is a choice, low choice, yield grade 3. Okay, number 4 is ends up just barely being a yield grade 4. So as we start from the top, this is of course number 2. Number 2 weighed 886 pounds. It had a lower than average dressing percent. Remember, the average dressing percent is 64.5%. 1 inch fat thickness, ends up being a 15 5-inch ribeye. Again, a pretty good size ribeye. This carcass should have about a 14.3 for the average for its weight. Ends up though being a yield grade 4 because it started out with over 1 inch of fat. And so because of that, as you take a look at that, you'll see the select. You'll see that it ends up just barely being into low choice. And we called it small 0. So it looked a lot like the small picture that you saw last night. And then you have the low choice. And then you have the live value, which is $1,369. That's times 96. And I will be sending you this data probably tomorrow night. And so you'll have this data sheet. Just know that when I send out the evaluations, the survey evaluation for the program, I'll be sending you out this carcass data. And so, but this carcass, because it's a yield grade 4, got an $11 discount for being a yield grade 4 per 100 pounds. So 11 times 8.86, that's, over $100. And then also it has a lower dressing percent. When you put all that together, this animal was worth about $70 less than what you would have gotten if you sold this animal on a live basis. And so that's kind of what they're thinking through. Yield grade 4s, very likely, particularly if they're lower dressed. Now, this animal is surprising that it's lower dressing percent, because as we told you last night, the fatter they get, they tend to have a higher dressing percent. This could be a weigh up. Maybe this animal, just ate more before it was shipped. Generally, they'll wait about at least. The animal will generally miss about 1 meal before it goes to harvest. So they'll miss probably the last meal that they would have eaten. Like if they're being harvested in the morning, they would have missed out because they want to reduce the fill because they don't want to have an accidental cut into the intestine and lose some of the contents of the intestine. So they'll what we call shrink them about 1 meal. So if they're going to be harvested that next morning, they might miss the meal that night. And if they're going to be harvested in the morning, then they might miss, in the afternoon, they might miss that morning meal. And so that calf maybe ate a lot just before it was shipped. For some reason, it ate more than the others. And that may be part of what's going on here, where that's just what we call the weigh up on that particular animal on the live basis. So it ended up being low choice, and the carcass ended up being valued only at $1,294, so quite a bit less. So that was number 2. That was another Angus. Now we have the red calf, and red calf, surprisingly, of those 3 beef animals, was the highest amount of marbling. Almost graded top choice, not quite. Almost there, small 70, you might notice that in the middle, but starting at the top, 865 pounds, 63.3% dressing percent, a 0.5 actual fat, 15.5 ribeye as a 2.8 is the final data. A maturity, small 70, low choice. So $1,313 is what we would see as a live value. And that carcass, because it was a yield grade 2 low choice, was $1,376. Dressing percent is close to 64.5. But so this is the animal that was the Brahman animal. You know, if I'd asked you which of those three was the highest grading animal out of that group as far as highest marbling score, I doubt many of you would have said the red calf. You might have, you know, but that animal we find out is a Red Angus Beefmaster cross. So why not? I mean, even Beefmaster cattle sometimes will outgrade purebred Angus cattle. And so again, it's more, if you look at that pen, what percent of that pen do you think would end up being choice? And so when you look at it, this animal had the genetics to do that and did a really good job being a yield grade 2, almost average choice. Then we have number 4, which was the Holstein. So the Holstein, heaviest carcass in the group, 890 pounds. Notice the dressing percent is 91.3%. And so what the feed yard tells us is that when those cattle come in, you have to guarantee a 61.5% dress or you will get a dock on those animals. So this animal's close to that average. And that animal's also pretty lean, 0.2 of an inch of fat opposite the ribeye, 14 square inch ribeye, 2.7 yield grade, A maturity, low choice, small 30 amount of marbling. So it ended up, and the Holsteins grade really well as far as quality grade. High percentage of them actually ends up being prime. This animal was a low choice yield grade 2. Now, so yield grade 2, Dr. Griffin later on will tell you the rest of the story because Holsteins don't cut out like their yield grade would indicate. And so I'll let him tell the rest of that story. They generally will sell those cattle on a live basis at $14 back. I didn't calculate that out because a lot of times they won't even let you sell it to them on a live basis. You have to sell it to them on a carcass basis. And you'll get that discount through that carcass. And that animal brought $1,290 as a carcass. But on a live basis, the feed yard tells me if you try to sell those on a live basis, you're going to get a $14, $18 discount on those animals. You'll still get a discount, not quite that high in the carcass, but as you take a look at it, so this animal did get a discount, and Dr. Griffin's going to tell you why that discount's there. All right, so next one is the dairy beef calf. This one didn't have a real high dressing percent, but this is a pretty lean animal too. And again, this lean of an animal that has some dairy influence, you would have expected, and they tell me that generally their cattle that are Angus Holstein crosses will be somewhere around 62.5 to 63% dressing percent, 62.5 being probably more typical. And so that's what the dressing percent would be. But this animal was a little leaner than what they normally would market. They generally would market this calf probably about 850 pounds as far as a carcass weight. 12 3-inch ribeye, 2.4 yield grade, A maturity, low choice, and ends up having a live value of $1,154. That's one thing about this animal. It will allow you to not have it'll allow you, they won't give you the dairy discount on these cattle, particularly unless they show a lot of dairy influence. These beef dairy crosses, you will not get the dairy discount. That's the real value difference in having a beef bull put on dairy cattle. And that's why the calves are worth maybe $100, $150 more per head as day-old calves than a regular Holstein calf would be. The grid price on this, because it didn't get the dairy discount, is $1,148. So dressing percent hurt this one, but it's a yield grade 2, low choice. And so that kind of brought it back into the ballpark of making very close to what it would have made on a live basis. All right, so I wanted to give you the results before we turn this back over to Dr. Griffin. And so here's the results. And some of you didn't put your first and last name, okay? So you might notice the possible score on this is 10. So I gave 1 point per animal. So 1 point for quality grade. If you got it right, you got 1. If you didn't get it right, you got 0. And then for yield grade, if you got it right, you got 1 point. If you didn't get it right, you got 0. So I added those up. And Maria from Fresh Farm Radio, Maria, let's give her a shout out for her. She got 8 out of 10. That's remarkable. It is remarkable. And then if you look at second was Grant, and then third was Monty. And then you'll see a kind of a tie as you go down there with Gregory, Matt, Toby. Way to go. And then you'll see this long list of people that had 5. There's 17, I think, in that list that got 5 out of 10. And those people that I've listed here, I've talked with the Beef Council. They're going to get some Texas Beef Council memorabilia, some either hats or aprons and things like that, and they'll get that in the mail in the near future. So expect an email from me if you're one of these people on this list. We figured if you got less than 5, and believe it or not, somebody getting an 8 or 7, that's outstanding. Generally 6 is the highest when we do these day in and day out. 6 out of 10 is really outstanding, and 5 out of 10 is actually outstanding, with the majority of people getting 1 or 0 correct. The cattle were all low choice, which would have thrown you off, and that's something that we want to talk about. Every animal in this group ended up being low choice. Think how differently they looked as live animals, and they're all low choice. Now, there were yield grade differences from like a 2.4 to a 4.0, and Dr. Griffin will be talking more about that as he goes through his fabrication data. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Griffin.
All right, Dr. Dan. We're going to real quickly, especially since the slides were kind of giving him a hard time here, we're going to try to get you a close-up of all these ribeyes real quick. So, and I'll take the eye covers off so I think you can really see this. Here's number 1. We're on number 1, not on number, we'd be 4 in the line, but this is number 1. And Corey's as close as you can get, or you want to? Okay. So here's number 1. Had 85 hundredths of an inch of fat as we measured here. Again, a grader would then look at the whole carcass to be sure that fit, and it actually does on this one. The rest of the measurements are pretty much self-explanatory there with carcass weight, and with percentage kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, we just left it 2.0 so that they're all the same. Then we looked at these little specks of fat inside just this ribeye muscle as marbling. And in this case, what Dr. Hale had was small 40, which was the other side. This one's probably closer to about small 70, Dr. Hale. But it's still low choice. It's still in that ballpark. Has a really nice bright cherry red color, all that stuff. And these were all ribbed at the same time, so some of these held up even a little better than other ones did. That's number 1. Here's number 2, which should look very similar, except it's a little bit fatter. Actually, as we looked at this one, we measured, and he's kind of been banged around a little bit, but had about an inch of fat there at the ribeye. These had very comparable ribeyes in terms of size. This one's 15.5, so they were mid-15s on both of them. Did very well. Again, we're looking at something in the mid-small range, so another low-choice carcass. But because he's a little fatter, he ends up being a yield grade 4 on the grading versus a yield grade 3. Now today, in a packing plant, they're going to cut both of these cattle. There was a day when we were just doing box beef with yield grades 1, 2, and 3, and they would send these out to somebody at a discounted price, and they would cut those and trim them and all those kind of things. But today, these are all being cut in the packing plant itself and put into boxes very similar. When we get on to number 3, and we're going to spend a lot of time on number 3 tonight because we've got him actually cut and we've got the information to show you on this one. This one, number 3, had a 15 3-inch ribeye, so almost the same size again. We didn't plan that this way. We really figured they would be different. And when we got them in the cooler, that's just one of the surprises you get here. Number 3 being the red calf, had a 15-inch eye, but because he was a little lighter weight and had less fat, he only had 5/10 of an inch here at the eye, and he really, his carcass really looks like that's how much fat he should have all over. Then he was leaner. He should cut out a higher percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, which is what yield grade actually predicts. So we'll see if that works here in just a little bit as we go through. Hurt him a little bit because he did have just a 63% dress. He could have been a little higher, but for the most part, pretty darn good carcass again. And so we will use him as an example a lot. Number 4 is the Holstein Calf. And we said, you know, we found some things with him that we didn't think were so wonderful. First off, you can surely see starting to discolor here at the ribeye. Now there's nothing wrong with this other than it's just running out of, this muscle's running out of energy. And so you'll see that some at the retail store when you see those cuts that are reduced for quick sale, those kind of things, you'll see some of that as well. But you ought to be able to see how rectangular this ribeye looks versus those other ones we just saw. It's quite a bit different in shape. If this calf had not been as muscular as he is, then this ribeye would look way different and be much smaller. He actually had a 14-inch square ribeye, which is pretty darn good for a Holstein. And because he didn't have very much fat, only 2/10 here at the eye, he was a yield grade 2.5. As Dr. Hale said, we'll talk about this some more later, but I've got some data that surely shows that a yield grade 2.5 in terms of yield grade would pretty much cut like a yield grade 3.5 or even a little worse. So they will trade off some muscle, and you'll see that they'll have a higher percentage bone, and we'll look at that because we've got cutout data on him as well. And then we just thought since we had these, we just had to throw this guy in there as well. You should, let me see if I can get you a little better angle on that one. He's kind of the in-between. He's quite a bit, I think, younger. If you really look at lean color on this one, it's really bright, really cherry red, almost it has a pinkish tone to it, which shows me that he doesn't have as much myoglobin in that muscle. He's really young. He only has 2/10 of an inch of fat there at the eye. We adjusted him up just a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong one, but he's still right there. He has about 3/10 of an inch of fat there at the eye. We adjusted him just a little bit, but he has a 12.3-inch ribeye, so it's smaller, but he's smaller carcass too. He's smaller, 722-pound carcass, so a little bit smaller, but still already has enough marbling in there to grade choice. He's kind of on the lower end of the choice grade, but would easily make low choice. So those are the 5 carcasses that we've got, and hopefully that gives you a chance to see those. Dr. Hale again's gonna send those out, so you're gonna see those a little more. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back and forth between looking at a lot of meat up here in just a minute, besides just these carcasses, and some slides to kind of give us an idea of what cuts do we get out of these, how do we cut them, all those kind of things that, you know, like I say, if you were here for Beef 706, that you would get an opportunity to do, and hopefully sometime in the future we'll be able to do that as well. But I'm going to share my screen with you, Corey. Okay, am I on? Good. Okay, so these are the carcasses, and these are just some quick slide pictures here, or a slide of all 7 of those sides as they were sitting there. And these are actually in order. There were actually 2 more of the beef on dairy. So these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And you've not seen 6 or 7, and they're not working with our group today, but just so you kind of got an idea of what those are. Are you seeing them? Okay. So somehow or another, we got it to work there. So good. Well, what I was going to say is, if we were going to do a Beef 706 here, we would let you guys come down here and we would suit you up with all the gear and armor I could put on you. And then we would start to let you cut these up. But if we didn't give you some kind of a roadmap, something to work with, then literally when we all got through with these 5, there would probably just be a lot of trimmings that we would have to put in the grinder to use for ground beef. So hopefully we're not going to do that today. We're going to kind of set it up a little more, because what I'm going to do is show you a little bit about what we would do in terms of cutting these carcasses up. And the first thing I would do is tell you that I need a roadmap, and my roadmap are really those bones. And so we're going to use those guys to be able to make some cuts that would be landmarks as to where we were going to cut. So first off, you've already done that just a little bit when we looked at these carcasses, because we ribbed the carcasses for grading, remember, between the 12th and 13th rib. So we've used that landmark already, at least for one time, to do the ribbing for the carcass. That also separates out the forequarter from the hindquarter. Okay, so it separates forequarter and hindquarter between the 12th and 13th rib. Forequarter is about 52%, the hindquarter is about 48%. When we look at that whole carcass, then we start looking at major primals. And if you look at that side that has all the colors on it and things there, the round is the big cut on the back leg back there. The sirloin and short loin together make up the loin. So that would be the second major primal. The rib would be farther forward and would be in the forequarter. And the chuck would be on the front up there of the animal between the 5th and 6th ribs. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute. As far as some minor cuts go, and again, if you remember last night when Dr. Clear was talking about how you evaluate these cattle, when you start looking at them developing a lot of fat in the flank, along the plate, along the middle portion there of the brisket, they're minor primals because they're going to be carrying more fat. They're also going to be thinner for the most part. And then we've got the foreshank up there on the front. So round loin, rib, and chuck, flank, plate, brisket, foreshank are the major cuts out of this, or major primals as we look at the primals. Now, as we start to take these apart, we'll make some pieces of primals that we'll call subprimals. And I'll talk just a little bit more about those as we start through this. But just so you got an idea of major primals and where they are on the carcass. And I use those bones because there are 7 cervical vertebrae, there are 13 thoracic vertebrae, there are 6 lumbar vertebrae, there are 5 sacral vertebrae, and there's a few coccygeal or tailbones that might be left on there, or that ox tail may have been removed out on the harvest floor when we do that. And again, this is about 48 hours to 72 hours after the animals were harvested and they've been allowed to chill, so we can get that meat down below 40 degrees as we go through this. Okay, so how do I know where those cuts are made and how are they put together and those kind of things? Well, there's 2 things that really help me a lot. One is institutional meat purchase specifications. And institutional meat purchase specifications are, that's a group of specifications that are put together by USDA, and USDA keeps those through the Agricultural Marketing Service, and they do all the anatomical locations and descriptions of those cuts. Now, one of the things that they don't do as much of, even though there are some pictures there as well, but the guys at the North American Meat Institute took that one step further and made what this meat buyer's guide is that's on the page there in front of it. They actually have descriptions of all those cuts for beef, lamb, veal, pork, all the poultry, some sausage, further processed products, all kinds of things like that. But if I see a number that's a 100 level number, I know that's beef. If it's 200, I know it's lamb. It's 300, I know it's veal. So it is the language of trade for this industry as we move forward from carcasses on through to retail, food service, export, anywhere this product's going to go. Well, a little bit about where we might make some of these cuts. And so I'm going to just kind of use my cursor up here and we'll talk about this a little bit. When we start in there, the carcass is rib between the 12th and 13th ribs, forequarter, hindquarter. And then as we start into there, now think about this. If we were doing this back here in the back, we'd lay that down on the table and you'd take a handsaw and cut all through those cuts, and we'd use the bandsaw to help us and those kind of things. But in a large plant where they're harvesting 6,000 of those a day, that doesn't happen that way. There are people that make one specific cut for 8 hours. So they make one cut on every one of those carcasses, or there may be 2 or 3 or 4 of those people that are making those same kind of cuts on one carcass as they go through. But we're going to separate this rib from the chuck, whether it's still hanging on the rail or whether we're back here on a table like we would here at the Rosenthal Center. And we're going to have a cut between the 5th and 6th ribs. And I'm going to keep that as close to the 5th rib as I can. Why is that? Because if we think about it, one of the rules of meat cutting is you cut more valuable from less valuable. Dr. Hale, if I ask them, what's more valuable, chuck or rib, what would those guys say?
Put it in the chat.
Put it in the chat. What would be more valuable, chuck or rib? Seeing lots of rib. I hope so. Let's just give an example of that then. If I'm looking at leaving that inch in between those ribs, on the rib, it's worth $8 a pound. If I'm on the chuck, let's just say it's worth $4 a pound. Well, if that weighs a pound, that's $4 a head or a side more value. So if I've got two sides, that's $8 a head. If I am cutting 6,000 today, that's $48,000 based on where I made that one cut. Well, that's a lot of value. That pays a lot of salaries. So making those in the right place, when we're talking about volume, sure makes some sense. Now, if we cut that chuck off, we're going to cut the chuck, brisket, and shank. And in the old days, we'd cut then across those ribs at a juncture of the first rib down here with the sternum, and we would cut all the way across, and we'd make what's called a square cut chuck, which is what you're seeing there. Square cut chuck. If we do that, we would start cutting across this arm section, and we would make those arm roasts you see in that picture. And they could have had the pieces of the rib bone still attached to them. In this case, we had taken those off. Once we get up here to kind of the head of the humerus, and if you're getting these done at a local locker plant, there's a lot of local locker plants that still do this. And so you may be seeing those same kind of cuts. If we think about then when we get to the head of the humerus, big bone in the arm up here, and again, those are all my road maps, I then start cutting this direction. When I cut this direction, we would get those blade roasts you see in the picture. And blade steak or roast, the only difference is just the thickness of the cut being 2 inches or more or less than 2 inches. And then as we get up here and we catch just this little ridge of the scapula there, we would see that over here in these cuts that we would call 7 bone. So that's the ridge of that scapula in those cuts. And that's pretty traditional in the way we did that. But now here's the thing. If we look at this 7 bone roast, this muscle is second in muscle tissue tenderness only to the tenderloin. This muscle is pretty darn tough. And so I've got to cook this so that this one's tender. Well, this one's way overcooked at that point in time. And so we're starting to see more and more and more of these taken apart differently and not done in the traditional way to do this. So if we did that, we could come in here and find this elbow joint, this bone, come across this humerus, big bone in the arm, across the ridge of that scapula, and take those shoulder muscles off that are kind of out here on the outside of that chuck. And when we do, we call that a subprimal. And in this instance, we call it the shoulder clod. And shoulder clod is really what we see in this picture. This is kind of the back side of it up here as it's laying on the table. So the other side would have outside fat, subcutaneous fat on there. Well, those muscles that we talked about that were more tender show up when we do this. One of those, that top blade, the one that sits right on top of the scapula, is now right here together. And it is the one that's second in muscle tissue tenderness, only to the tenderloin. So if we cut across that, we make these top blade steaks. The issue with those, and we do see a lot of those still in the stores, but an issue that we do see with those is right down through the center of those is a heavy, thick, heavy layer of connective tissue. And so this works pretty good for retail, but doesn't work as well for food service. But if we, instead of cutting it that direction, gosh, I hit on the button there. If I instead come in here, cut across to take the heavy connective tissue out, I always think about it kind of like if I had a big fish and I wanted to make it better, I'd cut the bones out of the center of it, wouldn't I? And so if I do that on this one, I'm able to cut that differently to make two big slabs of meat that I can cut into steak portions now. I've cut across the grain. I've even made it more tender. And by the way, let's call that a flat iron steak. So if you've ever had a flat iron steak, it actually comes from the chuck, not from some of the other areas of the animal that we call traditional kind of steak cuts. So it's a little different. Also, right along this edge, which was along the edge of the scapula, need to not press so hard, is another muscle that we used to put into trimmings all the time. That's the teres major or petite shoulder tender. Is a favorite of a lot of people. Actually, we don't see those used in retail very much anymore. We saw them there for a little while. And what happened? Dadgum, they got so popular with chefs that retail pretty much lost them. And you think about it, there's only 2 per animal. But if you think about that being a cut that's now worth $4 a pound versus ground beef at $2 a pound, there's a reason why that's being utilized that direction or that way. Okay, the rest of that, the big muscle in there, the triceps brachii, we can pull apart and we can use it, we can use it as these ranch steaks, or we can keep it together as a shoulder roast. So it can be a couple of things. Now this one's not quite as tender as the other 2. But it does work pretty well, especially if we're at medium rare. If we're at well done, that's one of those, probably needs a little ketchup or something along with it there to make sure that it eats well. But it makes a fabulous roast, and now we're cutting across the grain on that to make it even more tender. So it works well in a little different application. We're not just cutting a bunch of roast out of that chuck. The rest of the chuck is still back here behind this blade bone. And we're going to pull it out. And if we take it whole like this, we can cut chuck roasts out of that. Or even, remember now we're cutting between the 5th and 6th ribs. Well, the ribeye muscles don't just stop right there. And so there are a couple of steaks up on the back side of that chuck roast there that we could use, or chuck roll that we could use as a chuck eye steak. If you've ever had a chuck eye steak, or a Delmonico steak is another name used for that. The rest of this, a lot of times we'll see is a little chuck roll roast. Gosh, sorry. This thing's pretty sensitive. Or we'll use it as some boneless short ribs or something like that. When we do that also though, we get this chuck flat area over here that you see, and if you've ever seen one of those, you know that a lot of times that has a tremendous amount of marbling associated with it. And we think, gosh, that's going to eat so good. And it does have tremendous flavor and really a neat muscle to to utilize in several different ways. We can cut that across the grain into some steaks. A lot of times that would be referred to as the Denver steak that's there on the page. It needs a little marination. It needs maybe a little tenderization, but wonderful, wonderful flavor. There's another little muscle that comes off of there that can be used like a flank steak, and a lot of times we call that a Sierra cut. So that's all those cuts come from the chuck. Now we're starting to get things that different people can use. There's not a lot of people today that want huge, big arm and blade roast and those kind of things. So this gives us an opportunity to use those at some price higher than ground beef. You know, during this pandemic time, ground beef has done very, very well. It's been very popular and has commanded more price than we've seen from ground beef. But over the long haul, we got to find things to do with some of these big cuts to get them down to a size that work. Now, the other portions of this that you may see are, as we work backwards here from the chuck, is the rib. And if we look at the rib, there's a couple of things that are happening there. Again, as we look at that whole rib has 7 bones in there and has a bunch of muscles up on the front end. So you see has some cap muscles up here that really don't show up as we get back to the 12th and 13th rib area, but they are on the front. So if you're getting rib steaks with a lot of different muscles in there, the butcher's probably just cutting across a whole primal rib to get those. And so you may even have a little piece of blade bone there. Or you may get that end of the rib as a rib roast, and then the other portion down on the other end as a bone-in rib steak. Some of you may be familiar and maybe have had, or hopefully somebody's bought for you because of how much they cost most of the time, one of these big tomahawk steaks. And that's really that rib, but now we've made a decision to cut the rib long back up here in the plate so we can keep those big old rib bones on there as well. This store actually doesn't sell those all the time, but it's here in town. And when we have football games and big donors coming in that want to buy steaks like that, they supply them for them. So they work really well for that. But if we do that, we're actually going to not cut some other steaks, and we'll talk about some of the plate short ribs that would come from there that now we can't have bone in if we cut those because of these tomahawks. So there's some trade-offs all the way through this. If you don't like rib steaks with all of that in there, then you would probably see this cut coming out of the center of that rib, that whole rib, and this is a ribeye roll. And we do see those a lot. We use those a lot for ribeye steaks. Any of those primal ribs, even this subprimal out of the ribeye roll, can be used for what we call prime rib, because prime rib really doesn't say grade. Prime rib really says it's from the primal rib. And so we want to be sure that you understand that as we go through this. I want to be sure that we make that distinction. And if we do that, we can cut all these ribeye steaks. One of the things that's always been a criticism of ribeyes, if people don't like ribeyes, it's because those steaks sometimes have this big kernel of fat that's in between the two major muscles. You know, here's the ribeye muscle, here's that ribeye cap muscle that's really the spinalis dorsi, that if you're a ribeye lover, that's the candy on that ribeye. And so they've got both of those there and can have this big kernel of fat. Well, for 2 reasons. One, when we get these really fat ones, and also when we get some really big ribeyes. And I say, when we get up there that 18, 20, I've seen some even as big as 25 square inches. Those, if I cut steaks out of, portion steaks, are going to be so thin that we can't hardly use them on the grill. If we cut those and we sell them at retail, and we sell them and we cut them 1 inch thick, they're going to be almost, the price point of that package is going to be horrible. So what we're starting to see is taking these muscles apart and making a ribeye cap steak and a ribeye fillet that now we can cut thicker. And if we do that, these were actually some that we saw in a store, and you can see that They've just taken, instead of making this ribeye cap steak, they just roll that spinalis dorsi up and cut steaks across that way. So you can do it either way and make a portion that's almost 100% edible as we do that. So there's some neat things going on there. When we move back just a little bit into this loin, if we cut between the last two lumbar vertebrae, we cut this whole piece of the short loin off of the front of the hindquarter. And when we do that, we could then cut from the backside, we'd cut porterhouse steaks, T-bone steaks, and we might get a strip steak or two off the front. Because really what's going on underneath this is our big old tenderloin that sits under here, underneath the bones. And as it goes forward, it gets smaller and runs out before it gets to that 13th rib that is still in the loin. So if we do that, you can see those big porterhouses back here in the back. And down here on the front, here's a T-bone that comes from almost at the front. And then as the tenderloin runs out, we get a strip steak or two off the front. So we can still do that, but that commands a pretty high price point. And we're not seeing as many people demanding this cut as we have in the past. And if we do that, what do we do? Well, let's take those cuts apart and make a strip loin. This is the big muscle that was on the top, and a whole tenderloin, which takes into account both the part that was in the short loin and the part that was in the sirloin back here, together as a whole tenderloin. When we do that, we're able to have these strip steaks that we could call New York strips or Kansas City strips, or however you want to name them and define them, because they are the same. There's a few that are back here as another muscle comes in over the top, the gluteus medius, that may be discounted a little bit. Sometimes those are sold as vein steaks because they do have a second muscle, because what's happening is the longissimus dorsi, this muscle is starting to flatten out as it ties back into this hip bone over here. So we could do that on the tenderloin. Everybody pretty much knows what to do with the tenderloin. They've actually been pretty readily available during this pandemic time at a little lower price because food service hasn't taken them. And so we've seen more at retail and with price points that are much lower than what they would have been normal. So that's the tenderloin, most tender muscle in the whole carcass. And we'll talk about it a little more when we got the meat in here a few minutes from now. As we move back just a little bit further, this top sirloin area is this big cut over here. If we still had the bones in it, we would cut through and you'd have a piece of the tailbone, the sacral bones, and you'd have a piece of the hip bone in here. If we take it and make it boneless, we've got this top sirloin steak with all the muscle fibers running out towards you from this center muscle. But up here on the top, these muscles, the muscle fibers run this direction. And if I said again that if we can cut across the grain, we can make these more tender. So to do something with those, and we're seeing this done more and more, we're taking this off the top before we start cutting steaks. So it's a whole triangular piece that we can cut into these sirloin cap steaks that are just really tender for the most part, just almost across grades. Or we can take and curl that over and make kind of a C shape out of it, put it on a sword, and somebody will sell that in a Brazilian steakhouse and do a very good job with that. And they'll call it picanha at that point in time. If we do that, this center portion of the sirloin can be cut into steaks. We see this, there's still a little seam in there. A lot of times you'll hear somebody talk about a baseball cut from the sirloin, and that's what it kind of looks like there. It's kind of round and circular. Then we've got the other part that can be portioned out according to the size and shape of the cut we want to cut. When we do that, we do have some trim off this backside that we need to take off to make these more uniform. Anytime we can segregate out one muscle, we're doing a better job of trying to make these more tender. Now, when we think about the bottom sirloin part, there's really three muscles. Right off the bottom of that bottom sirloin, or top sirloin, is a muscle that sits right in here. It's kind of triangular again. If you're from the West Coast or you've been on the West Coast a lot, you probably had an opportunity to eat some tri-tip. And even though we use them a little bit here in Texas, they're probably an underutilized cut here, but are used quite a bit on the West Coast. You see again, once you take it out like this, all those muscle fibers run one direction. We're able to cut across the grain. These work well on the barbecue. Also, we can cut steaks out of them. This is an interesting cut because right now it's one of the higher priced cuts coming out of the Carcass. The bottom sirloin flap actually is kind of runs through the sirloin and the short loin in here. It is extremely tender. We see it used some for fajita type applications, but we also see it used a lot for a new cut that you're seeing some restaurants sell, and they call it a bavette steak. Bavette, which is a French name. So it works pretty well for several different applications. The bottom sirloin ball tip is really an extension of the round knuckle from this area of the knuckle. Because it extends up in here to the sirloin, if we don't want to cut sirloin steaks out of that, we literally can call this whole muscle complex, and we'll see the knuckle here in a minute, as ground sirloin. And you can see how lean it is. So if you see the ground sirloin that's 93, 94, 95% lean, that's why. It's coming from our calf, our thigh muscle area there, right up the front of our thigh. And so it's really, really a real lean cut. Okay, if we work backwards just a little bit from there, we would come in and we would cut the rump roast off of the very front of this rump, off the round, and then we'd start cutting round steaks off of this area. And there's that big round steak, but do we see very many of those? Not really much anymore. Here's the round bone, the big bone, the femur bone in there, and instead we're seeing this inside portion of it, inside round, eye of round, and the bottom or outside round flat, all sold kind of separately as big cuts. And from those, we're seeing all of these steak cuts that are developed from there. Obviously, these are still some that are challenged. We see a lot of rounds used for jerky production and other things like that, where we're cutting it very thin to keep it very, very easy to chew and those kind of things as well. Those are the big cuts that we were talking about there, with the top or inside round being the portion of that that's inside the leg, makes that leg really wide. The outside portion, the bottom round flats, this portion on the outside. The eye round runs right up the back of the leg. It's our hamstring. We call it our hamstring muscle, but that's the eye of the round. The knuckler round tip would be, there's our kneecap or the patella, and then off of that is this knuckle around tip. So big, big cuts from the round, have a lot of volume, but they do have some challenges that we don't see on some of the other cuts. Well, there's other cuts we haven't mentioned, and I want to be sure that I do that real quickly here before we start talking about some of the meat products. So here we go. From right on the inside portion of this flank area is that flank steak that's out there. There's only one per side. As we look down, there's a couple of muscles here. One's the diaphragm. The outside skirt actually kind of hangs out on the outside of the carcass right there. So that's the outside skirt or diaphragm, used a lot in fajita applications, but we actually export a lot of that too. We export a lot. What do we use? Well, you can just see this muscle on the inside portion of the flank right there is the inside skirt. And so both of those muscles are used for a lot of fajita type applications. The outside's always going to be more expensive. The inside's going to be a little bit cheaper. If you see something in the store called beef for fajitas, really what we're dealing with is a product that is just from anywhere on the carcass, but it has been marinated and can be grilled like fajita meat. Off the front of this, there's the brisket. So we take here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ribs, and we cut across those ribs, take those pieces of bone off, and there's our brisket that we use a lot. For as far as the ribs go, the chuck short ribs are these ribs right in here, ribs 2, 3, 4, and 5. They have that really pretty spinalis or serratus ventralis muscle across the surface of them, and it eats really, really well. We see a lot of those chuck short ribs going to Japan or to Korea and some other countries. We see a lot of these plate short ribs that are longer, and again, if we use those, we can't have bone-in tomahawk steaks from there the rib 6, 7, and 8 that have the same muscle on those. And those are very popular with our barbecue guys today, and they sell a lot of those, and they're not cheap. So we've got all these cuts, and how much of them do we make? And which one of those, Dr. Hale, if we wanted to ask a question, I'd say, which one of those cuts is the most prominent out of this whole carcass? Which one of those cuts? Most prominent. How much as a percentage? Which one of them would be the highest percentage of the side? Yeah, tell me which one of those is the highest percentage out of the carcass.
Well, they put there, somebody's asked, how many Sierra steaks, how many pounds of Sierra steak?
How many pounds of Sierra steak in a beef animal? Less than 2 probably for the whole animal. Yeah.
And hanger steak, asking about any hanger steak.
Well, I can show right here real quickly if somebody's asking about hanger steak. The portion of the hanger steak that's still here is the pillar of the diaphragm. And there's only really one major one. The muscle kind of splits a little bit, but it's only one right in here. And it dries out really quickly if we leave it on the carcass. So most everybody takes those off on the harvest floor and then tries to go ahead and package those after they're chilled. So they try to get those out and not let them dry out. They don't really have a lot of surface protection there. So we try to get those on off. That's a hanger steak. I've not ever had much luck with those, but there's a lot of people a lot of chefs that like them.
Well, answers that people are doing round cuts, chuck cuts, middle meats, briskets.
And so they're all about equal, right? They have there's rounds and chucks and ribs and, okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to tell you what we did here, and then we're going to kind of go back and forth a little bit with this so that you've got an idea of what we've done. And I may actually, in essence of time, am I okay, Corey? Okay. In essence of time, I may give you some of the answers, and then we'll just show them up here, Dr. Hale. Okay, so if we do that, this is number 3. This is the one we were talking about that we're going to have a lot of data on. And so you've seen this ribeye already. You saw the ribeye from the other side of it. And I cut this one here, and just to give you an idea of what we're going to have, and we'll be sure that all of this data gets distributed to everybody as we go through. It was a low choice. Had a small amount of marbling, A maturity, low choice, had that 5/10 of an inch of fat, preliminary yield grade 3.5, 15.3I, yield grade 2.8. The carcass weight was 865. One side of it, after it's hung in this cooler for several days, was at 423 pounds. So we lost it quite a bit if we just divided the carcass weight in half. If we look out here, in the columns, IMPS, Institutional Meat Purchase Specifications. Those are those descriptions of all of those cuts that I talked about a little earlier. And down the left-hand side are all those numbered cuts. So 120 is a brisket. If I had a 100, it would be both sides of a carcass. So you can kind of see how that works just a little bit there. So you've got a better idea. So there's all the cuts that we made on this one from the forequarter. And again, there's a lot of different ways to cut these up. If you just get on a bandsaw and cut them, you can cut those old traditional cuts. But we're seeing more and more of these pretty much boneless except for the ribs. And so if we look down through there, there's all the cuts. The next column over, the weight of each one of those as we cut them. We divided the weight of the cut by the actual side weight to get a percentage of each one of those. I just looked on, and Jody, I use you guys, USDA market news reports, and just use a weekly price so that I can get all the cuts off of there. So guys, if you look at those and say, well, it looks a little low, it's because you'd probably have to buy 40,000 pounds of this to get it at that price. Just so you know. And then we multiplied weight times the price to get a value out here. So we've got all of those cuts. Even down here at the bottom, we got trimmings and fat and bone and everything. And then down at the bottom on each one of these, I actually took and totaled. We multiplied that and we got 99.8% back. So we did pretty good on that. We totaled all that value. We doubled it so that you could see what a whole animal would be. Then we added something in called drop credit. And drop credit right now, or a week ago, was at $7.08 per 100 pounds live weight of the animal, which means we're going to try to get something for the hide, the head, the offal, everything off of that animal. And so that's where we are on that, and that would add another $96 there if you're a large packer. If you're a small packer today, this number is very small. A lot of packers don't even, like here at the meat lab, it costs us more in salt to salt a hide to hold for somebody than we're going to get for the hide. So we don't have those as a value for us anymore. So you look down there, there's the value. We valued these animals at $96 a hundred. And right now, it sounds like a really big number there at $445 up. Now, I will tell you that's without any overhead, and that number is probably today $200 or more dollars to get this done. So it takes quite a bit to be able to do that. So what I want to do now is, Dr. Hale, I asked him how much of each of those cuts that we made. Did anybody happen to say something about trimmings?
One person said you could make the whole animal into trimmings if you wanted.
Yeah, well, we don't want to make the whole animal into trimmings because we can sell that for more value than that would cost, or than that would make us. But if we look, really, it's kind of interesting because trimmings, of the things that we cut off of that carcass, trimmings, 80% lean, and this can be done a lot of different ways. And in fact, if we were in a large plant, that wouldn't be 80%, would just be one of the types of trim that they would be putting together. They would have 50%, 90%, and 73s, and 81s, and 85s, and they would just be able to combine all of that all day long into those kind of piles to do that on. We simplified this and said we're going to eyeball this trim at 80%. The other thing, though, we're going to get is bone. And in this instance, we got about 17%, and that's pretty normal for these animals, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 17%, 17, 18%, somewhere in that range. And then the third thing was trimmable fat. And again, this is not all the fat, but we're getting those down to about 1/4 of an inch on the outside of the cuts. Some of the cuts have none on the outside as well. So we got all three of those. And if we put those together, believe it or not, we've just accounted for 54% of the carcass. So it's pretty small, or pretty big. That's a big part of it. We're going to get more for fat and bone than we are going to get any other way, but it's, or for the trimmings. But fat and bone make up right at 1/3 of the carcass, about 33%. So that's a lot. And is that normal? Yes, I can tell you that's a really normal animal. We teach that it's about 1/3 of the carcass. We go on down there, the next cuts are the big ones from the ends, the inside round, chuck roll, outside round. If we hadn't cut that shoulder clod into pieces, it would be there with those. So those are big cuts from either end of the carcass. Then we finally get in there, there's a ribeye. We finally get to one of those we talk a lot about in about 7th, 8th place. Top sirloin butt, brisket, and strip loin kind of make up that top 10, and we won't go further. We talk a lot about ribeyes, we talk a lot about top sirloins, we talk a lot about strip loins and tenderloins because they're those cuts that were so popular when we really use them. They only make up about 10 to 12% of the whole carcass. And we'll show you a pile of those here in just a minute and let you look at those. So it's a pretty small percentage when we talk about that. This one happened to be 11%. Well, you say, okay, that's pretty good on volume, but what about value? What are the top value cuts out of the carcass? Well, lean trim's still at the top because we got so much of it. We go on down there, ribeye, strip loin, Inside round kind of worked in there right now. Tenderloin should be up there, but because again, today it's not as valuable as it was 6 months ago, then it's kind of dropped down a little bit. But what really happens there is the middle meats out of the animal and the end cuts kind of change places. But if we look at that ribeye, strip loin, tenderloin, top sirloin, those middle meats that we talk so much about, they make up 1/3 of the value of the whole carcass. So they're a huge value driver, even though they're only 10 or 12% of the carcass. So that's why we spend a lot of times on things like that flat iron and some of those cuts that have an opportunity to enhance value for us a little bit more as we go through. So I also came in here, we'll give you this information. We said, what if this wasn't choice? It was actually top choice. And there's some things there. If we go just to top choice instead of low choice, we made about $40 or $50 more, Dr. Hale, just to go through that a little bit. So let's go from this over to the carcass, or to the cuts, and talk a little bit about those. Okay, are you on video? Can you see me? Stop sharing. There we go. There we go. Okay. Yeah, let me get through some of these cuts and we'll go back and talk about that some. Here is that whole animal cut up. Okay? Here is our whole animal, I should say that's one side of the red calf. So here he is as a carcass. His other side's here on the table. Okay? And this is toward the head. This is toward the tail. So if we look at some of these cuts, just to give you an idea of what we were talking about here, if we think about that shoulder clod we talked about just a little bit, here's some of those muscles. If we look at them where they were on Bossy over here, here's the teres major. Here's that little cut that comes right along the edge of that. We call the petite shoulder tender. And they're really nice, long fibers in here. HEB here in Texas used to sell these, and they put two in a bag with marinade and call them Texas grillers. They just can't get them, enough of them, to do that anymore. Food service has really taken that. Well, here's another muscle, the top blade, the one that we talked about we make flat iron steaks out of. It sits right on top of the blade bone. So all of these kind of make sense. This is the one, if we come in here, we cut him right down the center. We take two big slabs off of here. Now we can make flat iron steaks out of this. So we can utilize that, and it's second in muscle tissue tenderness only to the tenderloin. So sometimes it has a little bit of a livery flavor and things we'll find, but for the most part, it's a really nice cut. The other one there on the shoulder clod was this triceps brachii muscle. Sits right along the edge of that arm bone. Really makes nice lean steaks. If you want something that's one of those cuts that compares in nutritional value to boneless, skinless chicken breast, this is one of them that really does that. So again, we can start using that for people that are looking for something that really fits in their diet. Now, why? Yeah, we got some liquid in this bag. And that is something that a lot of people have concerns about, even in a vacuum bag, but they also would have concerns about it if they were seeing that in a store. And they'd say, oh my gosh, I don't want that because it's got a lot of blood in there. And actually, that's not blood. That's myoglobin, which is a muscle pigment, and moisture together. And myoglobin's what makes our eyes see this as red. And so as an animal gets older, we see more myoglobin in the muscle, and that's why it looks a little darker to us. But really, that's not blood. That's actually the myoglobin that's there. And so it comes out with some of the fat or some of the lean or with some of the water as you see it in the bag there. Most of the time you don't see a lot of it in vacuum bags, but you do see some, especially in some of the leaner cuts. So you didn't see it in very much in the top blade, but you did see it in the leaner portion there in the triceps brachii. Another muscle, just to give you that example again, the one that was up here right on the other side of the scapula, it's not very far from where our top blade was, it's really tender. This is called the mock tender. And there's a reason why it's called the mock tender, is because it's not very tender. And so a lot of people will use this. You'll see a few retailers that'll actually cut steaks out of this. They look a little bit like a fillet. They wrap a piece of bacon around them and you think you got something until you get home. And so, but this muscle now, if we know it's tough, we can put this in a bag with some seasoning, do a pre-cooked pot roast with this, and it's fabulous. So targeting muscles for their ultimate endpoint really makes some difference in how we cut these and why we use these muscles the way we do. The chuck roll is a big cut that comes right from behind that blade bone. I can't really get it in there where I can show you, but it does have those, the ribeye steak look to this end of the cut. And when you cut those chuck eye steaks, they'll pretty much perform like a ribeye as well. As we go on back just a little bit, here's our ribeye muscle or ribeye roll. And again, if we've got this over on Bossy, it's going to sit just right up here over the top. Okay, and so we could cut ribeye steaks out of this, or we could cook it whole as prime rib. When we did that, we also took the bones off the back side. And we call those back ribs. And we use them as back ribs. And they're not going to have a lot of meat on them because the rib's worth more than the back ribs. On pork, it's just the opposite. Back ribs are worth more than the loin, so you see a lot of loin meat left on back ribs. But this is not a pork class, so I just want to do that. As we go back just a little further, here's the strip loin. It sits on top of these bones that we call the transverse processes of the lumbar vertebra. It sits right here. The tenderloin, and I'm not going to get it because it's kind of curled up over there, actually sits underneath those. So the transverse processes are the T and a T-bone, or a T and a porterhouse, whichever one you see. So we do see those sitting there, the tenderloin down here underneath, and you have to make that decision. You can't get T-bones, porterhouses, and strip steaks and tenderloin steaks really off the same side. I mean, you could if you really worked at it, but for the most part, if you're in your cutting orders, you wouldn't be able to do that much. So what happens? A plant does both according to orders. So they're going to cut both. We get those questions from time to time, is why I didn't get any of this cut or that one. And usually it's because it's not what they ordered. Here's a tenderloin. This is a really nice one. It's kind of curled up in the bag, but it is a very, very nice cut. The most tender muscle out of the carcass, and is quite valuable. The top sirloin is the one that we always question ranchers about, or caution ranchers about, as it is sometimes the target area for injection sites and those kind of things, sitting right in here on the hip. It actually has a piece of that that goes up on to the strip loin there, but the top sirloin sits in here. That cap muscle that we talked about up here over the top is the one that a Brazilian steakhouse would use as far as picanha goes, or something like that. Okay, off the bottom side of that sirloin, if it was still sitting over here, we'd have this little muscle. It's going to be hard to see, but you ought to be able to see it's kind of triangular in shape, and that's why we call it a tri-tip. It's 3 tips as it goes through. So we see that one. Also from that bottom sirloin, this is that bavette or bottom sirloin flap that we talked about some. And so it comes from down in there as well. back here on the round, the big cuts, inside round, the big one that comes from in between the two legs is this huge, massive piece here. And we see those, they're 20, 25 pounds, and they're going to be used for jerky or carving stations in a restaurant or hotel or something like that. The knuckle or round tip, big lean portion right off the front of the leg on the steers and also on us. A bottom round flat, another big piece, more challenged in terms of tenderness, right down on the outside portion of this leg. And then right up the back of the leg is the eye of round muscle, or if we were talking about humans, that'd be the hamstring. As far as the ones that we talked about from the other side, Corey, it may be easier to show over here, or maybe not. Inside, and here is the flank steak. There's just one per side. The skirt, or that diaphragm muscle sitting in here. Inside skirt, outside skirt, inside skirt. We've got chuck, short ribs, plate, short ribs. After that, you guys this ought to be easy, right? For you guys to cut one of these and do it yourself. Now, all I've talked about right here is what's on top of this table. I don't know, are you going to be able to get to those or not? Down on the bottom. Good. Okay, so if we look at what's down here underneath, remember, that's a pretty large percentage of the carcass. A third of the carcass is here in the middle as fat, and here on this table as bone. So we've got 2 full tubs of bone. We've got that fat there. And if we put those together, that's a third of the carcass. What else is down there is all that lean. And we're going to go ahead and utilize that for ground beef production or other products, pizza toppings, taco fillings, any of those kind of things. What do we do with fat and bone? We make, with the bones, there's a lot of bone meal, bone marrow. Yeah, there's some chefs that use some of that as bone marrow. We could have left some of it in some cuts. I see some dog treats that are made out of some of these, but phosphorus, different things like that. But when you get this sheet, if you notice, or you might have been able to see on there, the value for bones today is about 4 cents a pound. So we bought it at 96 cents a pound. And it's 4 cents a pound is what we're getting for it. Fat, we do use a lot of edible tallow still for frying. We do use different fat trim or fat for different things. But you can also see probably as you look at some of that fat down there that it still has a little bit of lean with it. And so there are companies in the United States who are actually taking that and using a cold process, heating it, warming it up just a little bit, but still cold, to get what we would call lean, finely textured beef, which today can be actually labeled as beef and not just as lean, finely textured beef. And so they would take that and be able to get more value out of that, trying to enhance the value of this animal by getting more for these cuts as we go through. Okay, so that's a demonstration of cutout. We haven't gone through any of the other animals, and I can do that real quickly. Dr. Hale, do we have time? Oh, okay. Okay, let me go through just a couple of things here then real quickly. So we're going to see those as quite a bit different. Here, this is number 1. he was fatter. And one of the things I wanted to show on him, just real quick, is, and what we saw on this one, number 3, was, it had 17% bone and 15% fat trim. We look at number 1, and these were cut by a little different crew, some of our students here, but he had 23% fat trim. So if you looked at that, instead of a third of the carcass is fat and bone, 37% of this carcass is fat and bone. Now, when we do that, and you're losing 4% more of the carcass, those are huge values. It's kind of like what you showed them, Dr. Hale, on the dressing percentage, and how that changes the value of the animal. Same thing here, as we really look at that, that accounts for a whole lot. Well, this one you say still made a lot of money. Well, one of the reasons why he did make a lot of money is he traded that percent fat and he had a high dressing percentage. So we had more of him on the rail, but unfortunately, more of him was fat. So he did make some money because he was choice, because he worked out to be a yield grade 3, but we lost a lot of it in fat. Number 2, really we didn't quite get as much fat off of him, but he was a yield grade 4 as well. And he showed it in lack of cuts. So only 10.7% of his middle meat, or his carcass, was middle meat. So he was on the low end of those high valued cuts. And he had almost 23% in fat trim. So you can see there, now he made $280. Well, if I'm at $200 to $250 in overhead, then he's getting really close to not making any money. If he'd been select, he loses, no doubt. So it's according to quality grade, yield of these carcasses, all of that has to go into play when we start looking at these. Now, here's our Holstein. And you can see even in the carcass picture there how much different he is when you look at him. For a Holstein, he did pretty good. He had a 61% dressing percentage, which to me it says he's pretty muscular for a Holstein. And again, he did have a 14-inch ribeye, so that works out well. But gosh, where we were talking about 15 to 17% bone, this one traded muscle for percent bone. And so the second highest percentage item off of the carcass was bone, and it was at 21%. When we value that at 4 cents a pound, then we're really tight on whether we can make any money with this guy or not, even though he's choice. So even though he made choice, and the other thing is on him, he did have a darker lean color. And that's just, that was within, about an hour of those being ribbed, the pictures I'm showing you. So you can see his color versus some of these others is quite a bit darker. Okay, so the Holstein really didn't perform. And actually, when we looked at middle meats on him, he only had about 9% of his carcass in middle meat. So you start losing a percentage of middle meats in the most valuable cuts, then we're really starting to lose money as we start going through these. And again, if those cuts don't meet some kind of specifications in terms of thickness and shape and those kind of things for the food service industry, then we can't use those there, and it becomes kind of a problem as well. Our beef on dairy, just so you know, he looks a little thin there, but one of the reasons why is because he is substantially smaller in terms of carcass weight than the others there. Has a 12.3 ribeye, which works out really well for a 722-pound carcass. His problem, though, and we really don't have an answer for this, is he only dressed 60%. So part of this is a lack of muscle, I think, or lighter muscled animal, but also he must have been pretty full coming in to be down right at 60%. We felt like he should have probably been a little better. He did have a little over 10% in middle meats, but he did lack a little bit there. You see though that crossing the beef on the dairy, he only had about 17% bones, so we get back off of losing so much on those bones, and he's more competitive there on price per the size of the carcass. At $215, it sounds like he's way behind, but he also has 150 pounds less carcass weight to start with. So there's some trade-offs there, but I thought it would be interesting to just see what each one of those look like a little bit. We'll be sure and show you this information and provide these printouts for you so that you can look at them a lot closer. If you're on a small screen or something, you're probably having a hard time seeing those, and I apologize for that as we go through. But anyway, that kind of gives you a little bit there, and I just did the rankings on those. And again, because those middle meats are going to still take the biggest part of the value, but the volume goes back to the end cuts, even on the beef on dairy or any of those. Well, if you come here and you're part of our Beef 706 program, we'll let you look at some carcasses like we did tonight, but we will suit you up and we'll hand you that saw and we'll let you guys get in there and cut them up, and we'll have more time, a whole day's worth of time actually, to go through and look at these and analyze these numbers and give you more information on these. But hopefully this was a pretty good exercise. You know, we're all looking for that, the best piece of product we can eat. And to get there though, we got to look at value. We got to look at that as it goes across from live animals all the way to the carcass and finally to something like this so we can get them cut and on our plate. So Dr. Hale, if you've got a minute or if we've got some questions.
Got some questions. One is just talk about cheek meat and oxtail. Figured you could at least show them on Old Bossy what we're talking about.
Man, cheek meat and oxtail. We are talking about both sides, both ends of the animal there for sure. But let's go through that for a second.
And then some people are asking about aging. So we're just by aging.
Kind of going through it again.
Yep.
Okay, we'll do that. A little bit on cheek meat. Now, cheek meat's going to be on the head. And so here in Texas, in fact, we still have an opportunity to sell whole heads. In fact, one of my barbecue guys this weekend barbecued a bunch of these heads, took the cheek meat off of there and made barbacoa cheek meat tacos for everyone. And so that's going to literally come from here. It has a lot of fat associated with it, tremendous amount of flavor. But it is truly the muscles, the masticated muscles that are on the outside of this jawbone. There's a few others, but that's where the major part of this is. We don't have a lot of lean up on the head or anything like that. In fact, that's where we're going to stun the animal and make him unconscious as we go through this process. We start talking about oxtail. They don't have to be an ox to have oxtail. Any of these have oxtail. There's about 14 to 17 of these coccygeal vertebrae. Some of them obviously get very small, so we're really talking about 6 or 7 vertebrae here that would have lean all around these vertebrae. This is usually removed again out on the harvest floor. The reason we do that is these dry out real quickly. So we're seeing those a lot of times used. Is it? Are you hearing me, Courtney? You can't? Can you hear me now? Can you guys hear me now?
That's better, Davey.
You're good? Okay. So if we think about those oxtail, we actually have 14 to 17 pieces, but really about 6 or 7 of those that have a lot of lean associated with them. And when they do that, then those are used in all kinds of dishes And oxtail has really become a real favorite for a lot of people. In fact, we're seeing here at the meat lab that they have a wait list for oxtail. And so people will come and pick those up whenever we've got them and are using those for a lot of different applications.
Let's go ahead and show the video and then we'll come back to some other questions. Yep. All right, good. All right, so this is, again, a couple of plants that have been put together in, you just saw them hanging. Generally, they're gonna hang in the cooler for about 48 hours before they start this process. They'll grade them, then they'll start fabrication. Right now, this gentleman's microfiltered, sterilized air between the seams of the muscle to make it easier to bone out. You can see some people looking for contamination and they're going to trim that off if they happen to see a hair or anything like that. This gentleman's job is to put a knife between the 5th and 6th rib and draw it to him. And he'll do that a couple thousand times. And there's a circular saw that's now, we're looking at a carcass. Remember, the head's down towards the floor, would have been if it was still there, and the round is up towards the rail. It's hanging by the Achilles tendon. And right now there's just fabricating the chuck. You see, that's called an arm chuck that he just dropped there. You see the brisket still attached. The main reason we're showing is just to kind of get an idea of the speed and how they're doing this and making these subprimal cuts. And you can see just dropped a brisket in a clod. And after those cuts are taken, what they'll do is then they have another group of people that will trim fat and bone out muscles and take out bones. And that's what their job is until you have the final cuts when it's all said and done. Every table is a different primal cut that Dr. Griffin talked about. There's the rib cut. And now we're coming to, I think, the loin cut. If you look in the background, you'll see rounds. Those are the round tables down on the other end. You'll see a femur bone there coming towards you on that top tray there. And so the major cuts go across the bottom conveyor, and they'll put bones and lean trimming that'll then get sorted, and that goes up on the top conveyor. And so those cuts will come down through, and you can kind of start seeing now they're going to be put into a vacuum package bag. And then that vacuum package bag, that's meat at refrigerated temperatures, will last about 45 to 60 days, maybe more than that. So here's an example. This is a top sirloin, and this person is trimming fat off of that top sirloin. Just actually, it might be a little lean trim that comes off. That lean trims could be called ground sirloin because it came from the top sirloin. So that's those cuts like he's trimming there. That's trimmings that would go into ground beef, and they could call that ground beef ground sirloin. That'll be sorted out. And there's all there right now. They're sorting out bones and lean trim, and they're making piles of, that was a combo of ground beef trimmings that would be ground for hamburgers. So now we'll look at the portion where they're doing the vacuum package bag. So this is that top sirloin that was put into a vacuum package bag, and it's going to be positioned in a kind of a micro chamber vacuum package. We call it the octopus. It'll kind of look like that. You'll see a top come down on top of it. And then also that layers of plastic will be melted together at the very tip where it seals the bag. And so there's the chamber coming down, pulls the air out and makes it a airtight bag, vacuum package bag. It goes through a shrink tunnel to with warm water that's sprayed on the top of it to shrink the plastic better around it to prevent something called leakers. That prevents it from having air getting back into the bag. Then it's put in the box. So that is a box of top sirloins. And we're just kind of following top sirloins through the plant. So that is one box, and that's all that's in there are top sirloins. They're all choice. That when I was there, they were, and when I videotaped this, they were doing choice. There's a box of choice briskets, and that's all that's in that box. And they'll have a label, a date, the grade on them, as well as the weights of the product that's in there. That one's going to go to Japan for international travel. They'll seal the boxes up, and then it will go into their box beef cooler. And again, I really appreciate them many years ago. So it may be different now, but this is when I was in the plant and they allowed me to videotape this. And you'll notice as we turn the corner, all these little baskets. So every basket is a box of beef. And so I'm zooming in right there and you can see individual boxes. The computer knows exactly what's in each one of those spots. Yeah, and those boxes weigh anywhere between 50 to 80 pounds, depending on what's in that box. And so there'll be multiple cuts. You know, for example, there'll be 6 strip loins in a box. So there's a box that actually one's going to go international, one's going to stay domestic. The brown one's the domestic box. And it's going to go up in the conveyor. The computer knows there's 2 different types of branded beef programs. One's a branded beef, Angus Pride, that they had. The other one's just the generic box beef that's generic choice. And then they'll plug the order in when those are ready to load trucks. They'll put an order in and it will automatically pull first in, first out into having the same cut. So this is a whole pallet load that we're seeing of top sirloin boxes that are going to be put together, and they're going to be shipped to somebody to cut these into steaks. And so that's a box of 5 boxes of top sirloin. You can see coming around, they're going to put PVC wrap around it to keep that tight so it won't shift when it's on the truck. And here it goes on the truck. And so what I'm going to do now is we're going to start at the truck and we're going to work back to the steak. All right, so that truck just arrived at a location someplace in Texas, and it's received. When the trucks leave, they're sealed. And if that seal's broken, they're not going to receive that. And so they're checking the number of the seal on that. Then they'll also do a whole set of safety checks of that product in the truck. And when they do that safety check, they'll be checking temperature, whether the bag actually became a leaker and actually allowed air back into the bag. All that means is that they either have to repackage it, or they're going to have to, if there's enough of them, they may actually return the product. In those trucks, there's temperature controls, and so they know where that truck is, and they know the temperature of the compartment in that truck the entire trip. Product is checked in. In this particular location, you'll notice that this shelf of meat is actually moving. And so for them to cut meats, they have a spec of 21 days minimum aging time on this product. And so you can't even get the product unless it's been aged at least 21 days. And so now that product has been aged 21 days. It's still in the box. That product will age in the bag and be tenderized, naturally tenderized, just like it would in the carcass. And now it's coming around, and they're going to next go ahead and start and begin the fabrication process of those steaks. So they're unboxing them. Boxes will all get recycled, be reused. Same thing with the packaging, will all go through, be recycled. And a lot of the things in here as they go through, you notice very hygienic. These are top sirloin, or excuse me, these are strip loins, and they're actually going to maybe top sirloins as I'm looking at them, and they're going to be put through a pinning machine that will help blade tenderize the product and make the product more tender. These people are specking out the cuts. They're trimming any excess fat. They're trimming any connective tissue. They're facing the cuts by just trimming both the edges of the cut off to make it easier when they actually end up cutting steaks. And so kind of making the product look good so it will be uniform when they actually end up going to the machine that will cut these into steaks. So that's a heavy layer of connective tissue that they just trimmed off of this. So sharp knives, that product then after it's has been kind of pre-specced out, will now get put on this conveyor and go into a machine that originally was designed to cut fish fillets. And it was then reconfigured, re-engineered to cut meats. and it cuts meats within a 1 ounce or half an ounce speck. So it measures the length and the width of the cut, the size of the ribeye, it measures, gets the weight, and it through just near infrared technology and computer assisted technology will cut these steaks. In this case, I believe it's a 12 ounce or 11 ounce steak within a half an ounce. And so these are all choice. They've all been aged 21 days. They're going to go into the machine. They're going to come out as a steak. You see them going into the machine there. And now they're coming out as 11 ounce steaks. The little pieces then will be collected, and they could be used actually for ground beef or beef. And actually, I think one of the places that they sell to makes that into their ground beef. Here's a whole group of top sirloins, center cut top sirloins that have been cut according to a weight spec and totally trimmed. Everything in this plant is followed through with a electronic identification system, so they can actually trace this back to the day and time that this meat was cut back at the packing plant. There's a code date that's put on every package, and they will have a spec on themselves that they will try to use this package within 21 days. So the steak, again, it's in a vacuum package bag, and it can be used and still have a really good shelf life, and probably longer than 21 days, but definitely longer, but they will use the product within a 21-day period. And so here we go. They're checking for things that might be a leaker again. They want a vacuum package this product to last, again, as I said, 21 days in a vacuum package at refrigerated temperatures. And then, again, it's boxed up just like the other one, put on a truck, and sent back to that retail store, or excuse me, to that food service establishment that we use those steaks. So I think it's giving you an idea of what happens and how your beef animal gets from a steer to a steak as you look at that product. So with that, I'm going to turn that back over to Dr. Griffin to kind of finish this off for tonight. I would say, again, as he said, the grade data that I presented as well as his fabrication sheets will be sent to you tomorrow night at the conclusion of the meeting. We will also be sending you an evaluation form. We sent you one last night. We really ask, we need your help. How can we make this better? So when we send that program evaluation sheet for tonight, please think about, I need to go to the last email and do last night as well. And so out of I think we had 300 people, we had about 50, and so we really need you guys to get kind of the best information as how we can make this a better program in the future. So Dr. Griffin, we're going to move it back to you and to your camera, and all yours.
Okay, good deal. Well, Dr. Hale showed you some things about what makes these middle meats so special. And we do use those in restaurants. And even today, when we're challenged with restaurants, these are the cuts that are being utilized all the time. And so we talked about these, and I just want to go through real quickly a couple of things with you here as we close up. First off, remember, when we're talking about middle meats out of this carcass, we're really talking about ribeye, strip loin, top sirloin, tenderloin. That stack right there makes up 10 to 12% of the carcass, but accounts for about 1/3 of the value of the whole carcass. So those are kind of interesting numbers to know, that very small part of it. So if you're looking at trying to do something with your cattle, and you've got somebody that wants these, remember, you've got a large percentage of this animal still that you got to sell some way or the other. And so it's hard to just say you can sell these and grind the rest. It sometimes will work on the math, sometimes it doesn't. So be sure that you kind of have that in the back of your mind as you start through this. And Dr. Hale said that there was a question or two on aging again. So real quickly, when those cattle are harvested, they're about as tough as they're ever going to be. And over the next 10 to 14 days, they're going to get more tender, more tender, more tender, more tender, more tender. And this is not going to stop, but it's going to start flattening out at about 10 to 14 days. And so that's why we use that. And that's why if you see meat in a retail store, you say, well, how long has it been there? Well, we've done studies that say by the time it goes through harvest, it takes about 2 days to 3 days at the least to get out of the plant. By the time it goes to somebody's distribution center, back out to a store, and is cut, we're at about 14 to 17 days for most of that product. So we're kind of in that range. So when people want to age them, and Dr. Hale said those sirloins were aged 21 days. Well, sirloin's one of those that needs a little more. So it will continue to go up a little, but not at the same rate that we're doing here. But everybody during the pandemic said, oh my gosh, we've got all of this meat and it's sitting in a warehouse somewhere. Well, really, we didn't have that. What we really had was all those parts of the distribution chain happening, and all of that was part of the meat that was in that chain. So we always try to be sure that you understand that there's not some this big surplus out here somewhere. And if we were trying to age these in a plant that harvests 6,000 a day, and they had to hold them for 2 weeks, dry aged, hanging on the rail, think how big that cooler would have to be. It would be this, you know, it would be massive to be able to do that. So anyway, if you ask about aging, that's kind of the aging curve. That happens, just so you know, in these vacuum bags and hanging on that rail over there. Exactly the same way in terms of aging. Now, dry aging, it's going to, we talked about that earlier, it's going to dry out more, going to intensify those flavors, those kind of things. But the aging, the tenderness part of it's going to be the same in each place. Okay? With that, Dr. Hale, are we done? Wow. Tomorrow night, you got some superstars that are going to be with you guys. Because tomorrow night, we're going to back up just a little bit and talk about more about some of the things that get the product to this stage, to this point. And so those guys are going to talk about beef cattle production with you, and they're some of our livestock specialists that are really fun to listen to and do a great job of presenting that type of information. So hopefully tomorrow night will be good. We'll all be on there, and if you've got questions, you want to ask those as we go along, we'll sure try to answer those for you throughout the evening as well. With that, okay. Okay, and we'll talk about a little of that, and I know tomorrow night Dr. Gill and the group that Dr. Pascal and those guys will do a great job of kind of filling in some of that too, and we'll be glad to answer questions here for a while. But if you, this kind of ends the presentation, but we'll answer questions for a while. If you've got retained ownership, if you know what your cattle are going to do, and in terms of that, just the more education you've got, the more predictable those cattle are throughout the system. If you retain ownership throughout the feed yard, then you have an opportunity to sell those cattle either live still out in the pen, but if you know more about them, you know they're high grading cattle and high yielding cattle, then there are grids available, there are formulations, all those things that you can take advantage of with the packer. And so, but it takes pens of cattle to do that. And according to the feedlot, it may be as small as 50 or it may be as big as a pen of 300. You just have to work with your feed yards to get to that point. But you can do some of those kind of things. The less you know about the cattle, the less you know about the meat that they're producing, the bigger risk you're taking. And that goes the same, you know, anytime if you're in a gambling mode, that's the way it is. The more education you got, the better opportunity you have to do well, even though sometimes it still goes south. But that's retained ownership, and honestly, the more you know about them, the bigger volume you can get. If you've got neighbors that you're going with, that those things have an opportunity to work. Yeah, and that's some of the issue that our industry's still working on. There are some ways to do that in terms of traceability into the plant. There are RFID tags and things like that. There are some groups that will be able to get that data for you if you've got an agreement with the packer. Since they're shooting all those with a camera and being able to get that information, you're more likely to get it today than ever before. But as you think about it, and I saw a question a few minutes ago, well, could I get the same one back after they've been on that whole kill floor and that fab floor and those kind of things? And think about how those work. If I'm doing this back here in the back and I'm using a handsaw and my knives, I'm doing all those kind of things, I can keep that all together. But what's happening in those large plants, like you saw in the video that Dr. Hale showed you, once they start into that room, we know what time they went into that room. But then as they start being cut, the rounds are going this way, the chucks are going over here, the ribs are going down this way, the loin actually goes down and is split about 3 different ways as it goes through. And so even back as far as when boxed beef started, if you had to buy a whole carcass, and they called it a 7-box style cattle. But at that point in time, you got 2 ribs, 2 chucks, 2 loins, 2 rounds, and a box with a whole bunch of other stuff in it, the briskets and all those kind of things. But they didn't come from the same animal. And literally, that's the way those fab floors run. And we didn't really say this earlier, but they sort those cattle. And then as they come into that fab floor, they come in as a quality grade. So most of the time, if a plant's got a bunch of primes, they're going to run those first thing in the morning. They're going to run as long as they can in that one grade. And then they may take a break. Hopefully they can take a break because that allows that line to kind of clear out. If not, they've literally got 800 people standing there waiting for the next grade, and they've got to have enough gap in between those grades so that they can change out boxes, change out labels, change out bags, all those kind of things for the next grade to come through. So it's all run as a grade so that when you get a box, you either get that grade that you bought or you get the next higher grade. Sometimes you might get a piece of choice in a select box or something like that, but you don't go the other way. And so that's some of the issue with keeping ID on that product through a large plant is there's just really no way to say, okay, this ribeye came from X cattle. I can tell you within a group that it was in there, but I can't tell you exactly which one in terms of traceability, at least today. Okay, well, Dr. Hale's going to put the link back in so you can get to the information and the video on the cattle. So you're ready for tomorrow night, and we'll see you guys then. So thank you for staying with us. I know we went over a little bit tonight. It's just a ton of information to try to get over in a 2-hour period. That's why we like to have you here for a couple of days to do this.